I think we're ready to get started. Hi, I wanted to welcome you all to this evening's event, which is a presentation and discussion with Brian O'Looney, which is hosted in joint by the Yale School of the Environment and the School of Architecture. My name is Andre Harwell, and I'm a senior critic in the School of Architecture and director of the Yale Urban Design Workshop, and I'm very pleased to be emceeing tonight's event. Brian and I met earlier today and started a really interesting conversation about incremental urban design, urban policy, and communities, both in Connecticut and around the country. And we're really looking forward to continuing that conversation with all of you in the audience. Following Brian's presentation, we'll have a few minutes for Q&A. And so I encourage all of you to post your questions either in the Q&A function of Zoom or raise your hand and I'll do my best to call on you and moderate. Brian is an architect, a master planner, and a principal at Torty Gallis and Partners in Washington, D.C., where he's built a practice that's focused on sustainable urbanism and community enrichment. He is a 1990 graduate of Yale College, where he was influenced by teachers like landscape architect Diana Belmori, unfortunately not with us anymore, and environmental historian Bill Cronin, both of whose important work and teaching emphasized the relationship between the natural and built environment. Brian later received his Master of Architecture from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Over his career, Brian has led the design of urban buildings, including a train station, a ballpark, and many different housing types, and master plans for mixed-use downtown districts and residential neighborhoods. His recent book, Increments of Neighborhood, published by Aura Editions last year, is a highly accessible reference catalog of American traditional and contemporary architectural and urban types, ranging from single-family houses to large civic buildings, all documented with plans and images and descriptions of the urban role each one might play within a compact, pedestrian-oriented neighborhood fabric. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Brian for his talk, Increments of Neighborhood.
Well, thank you. That was a wonderful introduction. I'm excited to remotely be back at Yale and talking to students who may share similar perspective and some background. I'm looking forward to just share a little bit of what has been a 15-year research effort to put together this project. And so this presentation, I'll try to make it quick, but the idea is to talk through what it took to put this effort together, and what we learned in the process. So we're going to talk about the goals of it, the challenges of putting it together, and the lessons learned. And some of it will be about bookmaking, some of it will be about the challenges of discovering types, and some of it will just simply be about what we've learned along the way. And so a little bit is to talk about the goals and what the intent was. We started thinking about the neighborhoods that we most love to be in and are charmed by. This is Georgetown, and what makes a neighborhood beloved. Looking at neighborhoods across the country where we've been and want to return to it. This is Short North in Columbus, Ohio, or Broadway in San Francisco. How does this come together over time, and how do we make something like this possible, or enable something like this to happen in our planning effort? New London, near where you all are in New Haven. I grew up in Connecticut, so I always have a frame of reference from Connecticut when I work, and again, thinking about other places and how they come together and be strong and make strong neighborhoods with different types of building form and different increments. And this is Chicago as an example of that, which is has incredible segue from very tall buildings to neighborhood context of many different types. And so part of our practice, we talk about type and how it influences neighborhood. And sometimes we realize that type and the influence are not necessarily the same. And so we came up with the word increment to reflect that, in that there may be types that masquerade as others in order to contribute to the surroundings is part of. You may have a community like Chicago where there's a lot of different types coming together, and that's part of the character, or a place like St. Petersburg where many types are brought into for a more rigid framework and character. Or places like Charleston where there's a scale that's the same, but the types may be different from neighborhood to neighborhood. And that you can see that in the two images on the left, which have very different characters because of type. And so just to show a little bit of our work, to show the framework where we're coming from or in putting the book together. This is a project in South Orange, New Jersey. The upper right shows imagery of the community where this very large building was landed into the town, and the colors simply represent different identities within the framework of the downtown of South Orange. The train station where you get off into town is here, and in placing this large project into the community, we realized that it needed, and we're forced by the community to come up with ways of scaling it down to take what is a type 5-story wood building, very large building, and make it feel like it belonged in a community made of generally smaller buildings. And this is not respected to style. This building actually has two traditional building identities and a modern garage identity. At one point, one of the traditional identities was a modern identity, and we went back and forth with the community and discussing what it meant to have a modern identity and what their view of it was. And we ended up where this is, where there's one modern, where the garage represented the modernity, and the other buildings reflected a present take on what they had in their context, which you see again in the upper right. Similarly, in New Jersey, another transit project, this one where the whole transit parking lot is being transformed into a district on the other side of the station from the existing downtown. This is a place called Somerville, about 25 minutes north of Princeton. The images of historic Somerville are on the left. And again, looking at the project on the right, or the project that we've added in the lower part, the image on the right, there's only two types in the whole project. And the question is, how do we take those two types and make it feel like it belonged to that community and that neighborhood? And so we started creating scaling efforts in a way that made them part of an assemblage, part of one community at the same time, were broken down in forms that were anchored realistically to the ground, and coming with a way of addressing form. This project here is one we did in Alexandria, Virginia, a place called Potomac Yard. And Alexandria has a tradition of a whole core that's federal and strong. And Potomac Yard was not part of the core, and they made a conscious decision of wanting Potomac Yard to have a more aspirational, modern outlook. At the same time, there are a lot of guidelines in terms of having the base, middle, top, and other attributes of their core that they appreciated and wanted to see in the newer buildings. This is one building. So part of what happened with this that's interesting is rescaling a large building into 4 identities and allowing the ground plane to reflect an increment that they wanted to see occur. So even though the ground floor is 90% supermarket and 10% residential building, you don't feel that when you look at this building. And that was an important design goal for making the neighborhood feel strong in the long run, as other blocks have come around and have been built with similar attitudes and design methodologies. And so, I worked for a firm, David Shores, after working at Caesar Pelle's office. And while there, I was worked on a great job right on campus over on Science Hill. And while doing that, and that's a dream job for many people, I got to work on a ballpark, but we put together this downtown in a place called South Lake, Texas. And when it was all done, the community threw a parade, and I thought that was amazing. And so I pushed further in my career trying to find opportunities like that, where we can make places where a whole community could come together and embrace what you put on the ground. And sometimes they come together both positive and negative ways. The image on the right, the row on the right, is all from a project in Hampton, Virginia. The bottom image is a parade that they threw, but in 2012, I think. But the upper two images are from last year, where they had Black Lives Matter protests. And that was part of how that project centered and became a focus for this particular community. And so one thing I've been passionate in our work and my firm in general is about is trying to create places that the communities find ways of investing in them. And so writing this book, it was partly a reaction to an essay written by Chris Leinenberger in 2005, where he outlined the 19 standard product types that the real estate market was producing in the suburbs in the world. They were 19 types, and this is an array of those 19 types. There were 5 for sale housing types and 14 income producing types that if you left school and wanted to become a developer, this is the kind of stuff you'd end up doing. And he wrote the article as a reaction saying, how do we get to making other types that contribute to neighborhoods, that contribute to walkable places, that contribute to infilling the communities that have been harmed by automotive design. And so the book we wrote was a way of responding to that and compiling the types that have been built since 1995, basically post New Urbanist movement, to help folks who are interested in those kinds of places. And the interesting thing about the Chris Leinberger article is that there were 19, but they all relied on a 20th type, which was surface parking. And so the key attributes that we look for in the types we assembled and compiled were that they created an occupiable frontage, that there was engagement, the street frontages are active, the pedestrian oriented, they have doors that activate the street, they provide connectivity. And the final one is the most important, which is they allow for personal investment, whether you own the property or not. If you're a renter or a retail tenant, you still invest and present yourself within the public realm. And so the book came together. We found 140 types that were built, 33 of which are greenfield types that came from the new urbanism or other kinds of projects like that. But 66% were from infill projects, the new projects that contributed or reconnected urban tissue, urban context. There's a whole topic I'll get to at the end, but one thing we learned that was these types are symbiotic and they reinforce one another and they have an influence on each other. And that is becoming measurable, which was an exciting revelation, and that's being pursued by a lot of groups today. What we didn't include were what I'll call patron-sponsored types. So custom homes, branded retail, corporate headquarters. We have the essence of these, the sort of distilled types. So we have pad site restaurants that contribute to urban form in the book. And we have office buildings that contribute to urban cities. With the office buildings that can be transferred from one user to another and aren't so customized to a point of difficulty of transfer. It was interesting in that thinking about it, we referred back the group, to the great essay by Philip Johnson on the crutches of architecture. And in many ways, even with the distillation, trying to get down to the base market product, if you will, there was still architecture. There's still a reaction to 5 of the 7 characteristics or crutches that Philip Johnson talked about. And interestingly enough, style and history was not one of them. There's most of what we have, although they're presented with a facade, they're style agnostic. And that was an interesting attitude and lesson learned. And so it's broken into sections of the book. There's townhouses and mixed use buildings. and we've tried to find the most successful implementation of the types. And most of them are North American in context. There are a few Australian examples, and their development industry tracks similarly to ours, although not identically, and we can talk about that if anyone's interested. And then we also, as I was writing, it really was about market product, but I was working with an academic publisher initially, and they really strongly asked us to add public buildings to the mix, as well as mobility types. And we learned a lot from the mobility types. And so with mobility, we started to learn and were able to start compare the impact of privatized mobility, the automobile, as compared to other types of mobility, either bikes or transit. And we brought on the former head planner for WMATA, the DC agency, to help us synthesize and sift through and find the essence of the particular mobility types in that. Nat Bottenheimer helped us figure that out and talk that through and come up with the comparisons of the different types in the mobility part of the book. In the public buildings, we talked to contractors and architects, some we've worked with, and others, to try to figure out how, where the divisions were in type. Another goal was just to share things I wish I was taught in school. And frankly, I wished I saw more naked buildings when we were students. So understanding what's behind the type, what makes them tick, was part of what we tried to discover with the effort. And so these are all different types, and before the facades are put on them. And again, it's agnostic. You can't tell from looking at these, for the most part, whether they're going to be traditional or modern when they're done. And finally, then help evolve the incremental thinking in planning and architecture, so that there's less fear about mixing type, because in many ways, in most instances that we've seen, it provides richness and character to neighborhoods and communities. And again, those initial neighborhoods, Georgetown, Short North, the Lower East Side of Manhattan, there's a lot of mixed types that make them rich in character and have character. So some of the challenges of putting the book together: simply trying to find a way to present this information in a succinct manner that made it easily accessible. And so we came up with this spread with a large image on the left, data and a description on the lower left, construction imagery in the lower right of the right-hand page, a relative scale image in the upper right that you can sort of fan the book and see everything at the same scale highlighted, a missed opportunity that can show really bad examples, and then plans and other kinds of graphics in the lower left of that right page. And the way this was organized is it allowed us to pinwheel the different sections on the right to grow or shrink them depending on how much content we had, because some types had different levels of content for the different categories. And that helped us put it together in a reasonable way to make the content accessible. There are a few types we also were able to add. There's so much information, we added extra pages, but for the most part, the types are presented in 2 pages. We also it was just difficult logistically. We had to collect, there's about 1,000 images in the book, and we had to get a piece of paper signed for every one of them. And so that's hard. And so we relied on a lot of imagery. I relied heavily on the firms that I'd worked for in the past. So there are more images from Tortigalis and from David Schwartz's office and Cesar Pelli and Associates and other firms, because I was given good access to the imagery of their catalogs. But generally, we pushed hard to it's not intended to be a firm or a book that's presenting the work of those firms. It's intended to be a book to present the best examples. And so sometimes I replaced a lot of Tortigalis and the other firms' work with examples we thought were better or more exemplary of the type from other firms, and then struggled to get the sign-offs on the imagery. So in this particular spread, the upper images are Tortigalis. The images on the right are photos I took with my camera. The 2 plans on the middle of the right-hand page are Tortigalis plans, but the rest of them come from Anderson Kim, and we got Anderson Kim to sign off on that. But that was hard. And then another challenge putting the book together was defining types. What's their market distinction? What's their role? And a lot of people didn't even, some of the reviewers of the book putting together were like, why are we talking about all these different townhouse types? And they had no idea how different from a market perspective a 12-foot townhouse is from a 16-foot townhouse, and what you're enabled to do with an 18-foot townhouse, because you can now park 2 cars underneath it that you couldn't do with a 16 or a 14. So figuring out those distinctions was important. Also, you know, generally thinking in terms of what makes something different in the marketplace. So we had a little flack on the Victorian or the picturesque home, but it truly makes a different type. There's always this inflection in plan that happens because of it. So we kept that as a type in the book. We wanted to academically clarify missing middle types because it's a vague category that isn't well expressed. And we realized that missing middle is a lot of multifamily corridor and walk-up types, but really there's these stacked residential types, which are walk-up and often self-parking types. So you can walk in, your entry on the front, parking in the back types that we wanted to categorize and put together in a section of the book. And there's enough of them where you can put a whole section together. There are 3 unit types, there are 2/2s, they're the standard English basements. All of those were put together in the book in a way to express these very important contributor types that form a lot of these wonderful neighborhoods that have missing middle product. And also and we want to expand the notion of missing middle. So many of the publications out there are talking about residential types and walk-ups, but there's a lot of flex types too that should be known and thought of. And this is one from the Torty Gals portfolio where the ground floor, and these are wood buildings, which most commercial buildings are not. And a lot of people don't realize you can build mixed-use buildings out of wood, and that's an important thing to learn. And you can make expandable retail. LiveWorks are limited because they're 600 square foot tenants on the ground floor that end up being nail salons or real estate agents. But when you make an expandable type, you can have a lot more flexibility for tenants. And as this image shows in the middle, that's a construction of that. This is another flex type that starts out its life as residential because the market's not there day one, but they're expanding the neighborhoods around this particular project so that the ground floor expands. And you can see how it could clear out in the future for doctors' offices or commercial. And this is the master plan. So the main street had commercial day one, but these side streets were flex units that could go from residential day one on those streets, but eventually to commercial. And that flexibility made those buildings buildable day one, and then the context, the connectivity present on the first day of development. You know, and then one thing we learned, one challenge was trying to demystify courtyard types. And really what we learned was that courtyard housing is just assemblages of other smaller types. And this came from a long conversation I had with Stefanos Palazoidis, who's now the dean at Notre Dame. And his firm is very passionate about courtyard types. And there are courtyards that are assemblages of single family homes, which means they're in a different code section. They're residential code, not multi-family or IBC code, International Building Code. There are 2 types of townhouse courtyard buildings that one, you can surface park like the single family courtyard type, but everything beyond that, anything more intensive than townhouses has to be podium parked. And so there's a great podium parked example in New Haven that Herbert Newman did at Whitney Grove, and the examples in the upper right. And then more intensive courtyard types as you add more intensive multifamily or stacked unit product into the mix. And that creates the different types of courtyard product until you get to the Del Mar example, which has retail and corridor building and walk up and townhouses all in one, and office buildings all in one project. So lessons to share. This is the last part of my quick presentation. The impact of the building code and the economics of housing on what gets built. We see a lot of master plans out there where there isn't an understanding of the building code, and consequently the codes ask for a size or scale that the building codes don't support. And what do I mean by that? So the residential code allows houses to get built up to 3 stories. You can also put townhouses together. Anything more intensive than that, you can put 2 units stacked, but you can't put 2 stacked units next to one another, otherwise it becomes an IBC building. The next tranche are wood buildings coming from the frame world. The type 3 tranche is an interesting one, which comes from the Chicago world, where there used to be masonry bearing walls and wood floors. And that became a type that the drywall industry pushed back on and said, well, wait a minute, those masonry walls are 2-hour walls, and we have a 2-hour wall too, with just have more drywall on it. You should allow us to do that. And in the end, most jurisdictions agreed, not all. New Jersey doesn't. A lot of the Chicago suburban jurisdictions still don't allow them. But you can build now, as long as these type 3 buildings, mostly out of wood, and you can build them up to 8 stories. So you can have a podium of 3 stories of concrete and then 5 stories of wood over that. And that is a type that's getting built. The next tranche you build the light gauge hotel type over a concrete podium, and you can get up to 120 feet in 12 stories. And you see that a lot in Denver right now. There's a bunch of these buildings going up at the moment there, because that is solving their zoning code. The next tranche are tunnel form or preform buildings, which are cheaper than the site cast or steel buildings that create the super high rise. But you can see the difference in cost. And one thing that's important to know, and a challenge for those who are interested in planning, is that the cost of urban intensive construction is more than double the cost of inexpensive suburban housing. And so part of the reason the suburbs are attractive is that there's a real cost differential from the requirements of construction between what we can build in suburban places than what we can build in hyper urban places. And so we have to understand that when we want to build affordable housing in hyper urban places, there's a true cost to that. And so how do we solve that? Big issue. There's also a challenge with parking. When you don't have transit, you are privatizing the mobility costs on the private sector. And quickly, this is an array that just show the difference in cost. A surface space is $5,000. A wrap garage triples that. So if you have a dumb parking garage, precast parking garage, that is 3 times the cost for every space that a parking lot is. Stackers are actually less expensive. You can find a way to put stackers or find a use that works well with the challenges of that. It's $10,000 to $15,000 a space. A surface paved lot, sort of a nice plaza, is double the cost of a asphalt lot. If you have to put a nice facade on your garage, you're upping the cost by $5,000 to $10,000 a space. And then if you go underground or start looking at some of the automated systems, they're anywhere from $25,000 to $45,000 a space. And why this matters, why you need to understand that, is because housing costs, oftentimes the most expensive part of the housing cost is the parking component that's required of them. It's something not intrinsic to the housing. So interestingly enough, I talked about housing being expensive in the cities because of the construction costs. Well, it can end up being a lot cheaper if you allow the transit to serve the housing. So a bathroom costs $7,000 to build for a unit, a kitchen maybe $12,000 to $15,000. But if you're in a place in a city that's requiring underground parking and requiring 2 spaces for that unit, you're requiring $50,000 to $100,000 of parking to serve a unit that you could probably build for $50,000. So that's a big challenge that we need to resolve. And then finally, that parking cost impacts the yield of the land. Whoops. So these are all type 5A buildings. These are all 4-story wood, double loaded corridor buildings, or single load in the case of the wrap garage, that are built out of this wood construction. But if you, by privatizing the mobility choice, you are impacting how much the land can yield with that product, with that house, that type that you can build for $110,000 to $120,000. So if it's surface parts, you could only get 30 units an acre. If it's got a precast deck, you're only able to get 55 units an acre. But if you have transit, you can get up to 80 units an acre with that same construction type. And so that's an important thing we learned from putting this book together. And then another lesson I learned is if you're just trying to wrap the parking load of commercial uses, it's really challenging. And so the image in the middle, the upper middle, is trying to come up with a block size that surrounds the parking load of 2-story buildings. And the size of that block is 400 by 400 square feet. So you have commercial uses just to envelop the parking load in a cost-effective way, it's a 500 by 500 square block, which is basically double the size of the Fort Worth city grid. If you had to do 4-story buildings and wrap the parking load of those 4-story buildings, you're talking about a block the size of the New Haven Green to wrap that parking load. And so it's a big issue. And so what we often do is we often try to marry commercial uses like we showed at Baldwin Park. So there's commercial uses on the ground floor on one side with lighter load residential uses, either tucked under townhouses or walk-ups. And then you can come up with a block form that's functional. Parking is actually also more cost-effective vertically. This is the section through Southlake. There's office over retail, and you can get 4 stories of parking in the same height of the 2 stories of commercial uses. And actually you can screen even more height if you needed to, if you wanted to get tighter blocks, but that was the model that was used for Southlake. And so this is the Southlake plan, which started out day one as a surface park destination. So you made the place, you established a vision for the attachable fragment of urbanism, and then it grows over time. And eventually the blocks trip a deck. So you have 2 sides of every block built that make frontage. And then when you trip the deck, you can finish completing those blocks. And that's what's happening in the upper part of this image here. And then finally, 2 more points. One is about incremental empowerment. The images on the screen are large government forays into master planning impositions on a community. The center one is, the big image is the House of the Soviets in Kaliningrad. But the ones on the right are all from the United States. The top one is 100% private sector. The bottom one is 100% public sector. And the one in the middle is a public-private partnership. But all of them were grand visions, heroic efforts to try to redevelop a town. And because they didn't consider personal investment, they actually turned off the surrounding areas. And so in Stanford, you can go and you see the businesses struggle surrounding that shopping mall struggle. Interesting, one of the conversations I had with Andre this morning was about Hope 6 and how that didn't necessarily end up with the same results, partly because they tried to come up with incremental responses and invest in creating personal investment opportunities for the folks who live there. None of these projects on the screen now are ownership, home ownership. They have home ownership components, some of them, but most of them are predominantly rental. And these are all traditional, and they come from the Torty Gal's portfolio. The bottom row is for military family housing. The upper 2 rows are all Hope 6 housing. But part of what was chosen for these decisions, and we can debate that, was to make these communities feel like they belong to the cities they're in, was reflecting the architecture of those jurisdictions. So the program, the type in every one of these buildings is pretty much the same, but the reflection of their community was important. So the housing in Tacoma feels like it's in Tacoma, and the housing in Memphis feels like Memphis, and Cincinnati has attributes that say they belong in Cincinnati, and Fort Irwin in the desert talks about being in the desert. And that created strength and investment. So the folks that lived there bought into this notion, felt like they're part of the overall city and the overall community, and defended and would put Christmas lights out and the things that you do when you have ownership and personal investment. And this is another plan, again, with more types, more home ownership, actual retail being brought into the project. This is a choice neighborhood, which was the next program that came on after Hope 6. And this just shows you how this neighborhood is developing and the different kinds of types that are brought into that. Again, with more of a stylistic mix, there's more modern and traditional buildings there. And then finally talk a little bit about the latest program that's out there, which is the Opportunity Zone program. The map on the right shows you where opportunity zones are in the United States. And then the left image shows places that are redeveloping that have sat stagnant for 40 years, like Asbury Park. There are a number of projects starting up there because of the focus of financing on this community. Other places, and we can talk about the politics of what parcels got assigned The zoning, and that was political. Some were done with great intentions, some were very strategic. This is a project in Atlanta we're working on at Torty Gallis that has a 100% senior building that got built first and had no opportunity zone funding, but the rest of it's in an opportunity zone. And the idea for this site is to bridge its neighbors on all sides, which is the Coca-Cola headquarters, downtown Atlanta, Georgia Tech, the English Avenue neighborhood, and then the great campuses, intellectual campuses of Morehouse and Spelman and Clark universities, and bringing them all in one neighborhood where all feel they belong. And so the architecture starts to talk to that a little bit in terms of the color choices that come from the universities and from the Atlanta team colors, which are all red and black. And then this one is in Baltimore. We're doing the building in the upper left. There's a lot of architects involved here. Again, this is a waterfront parcel in Baltimore, so it got the best financing from Kevin Plank, the owner of Under Armour, and Goldman Sachs. And we can discuss whether, what that means. And then finally, I want to talk about measuring influence and value and get back to the notion of measurement. And we're in really exciting times. We can start measuring the impact of planning. And there are firms like Supernormal who are out there looking at, if you add a coffee shop or you add a restaurant to a neighborhood or you bring a supermarket back, how that changes value and how that changes perception and strength. And it's an exciting time to be thinking about these things and thinking about, well, if you put a destination, what does that mean for the community that surrounds it? And even though those destinations may be very formulaic, does it, we can start to measure, well, with the residential building in that destination versus that multifamily building, which is exactly the same type, that isn't walkable and isn't in that place. And so with that, I'd love to have a conversation about any of or all those things that I hope this book will help to start more growth in thinking on for the future. So with that, I'm done. I hope I didn't go too long. So, okay. So that was a little over a half hour, but not bad.
Sorry, I was muted there. That was great. Thanks, Brian. So I guess before we jump into the questions from the audience, I just have a couple of comments and maybe a question. I mean, one is that in architectural circles, typology is a kind of slippery term, right? It refers to a lot of different things. And it seems like what you're doing here is combining a traditional definition of architectural type with also something about market differentiation, so that the housing types are not only about their physical form, their partie, but instead really take in something about providing diverse, let's call them unit types now, diverse types of housing for different kinds of people that can sit cheek by jowl in neighborhoods. And I was struck by the 19 standard product type description slide that you showed earlier, because I think as urban designers and architects, we often have these conversations with developers who say, yeah, but I can't do that because these are the rules. This is my product. This is the pro forma. The bank has already approved this. So I guess I'm wondering whether part of the aspiration of the book has to do with trying to create a foundation where you can make arguments with developers about maybe more diversity, and then also whether you've had success doing that in your own practice.
So that's a great question. And yes, that's an intention. And that was what the call was almost from Chris Lineberger's article, is we need to come up with these types. And so that was part of what we strove for, but part of it was just reinforcing and just what the market's already saying. It's great for an architect to try to envision or develop a new type, but sometimes we're not all powerful, and we talked earlier about collaborative work, and the architect's art is about the collaboration. And Deanna Balmori was about bringing the folks from the environmental sciences school with architects and landscape architects and talking about how we can make greater places together. And in many ways, that's part of what this effort is reflecting, in that we have to respect what those bankers and those developers and those market forces are telling us, but we can push back. And there are types that are out there that have been invented, and that is a sign of true genius. And maybe we've come up with a type or two, but really trying to share all the other ways that things have been brought together. I mean, honestly, the courtyard housing of Mole Polyzoides they're incredible inventions. But a part of it was new inventions, looking at the marketplace today and the building types that are getting built, and also looking historically at the California courtyard type and trying to evolve that in today's marketplace. And that's an invention. We, to line the back of one of our retail buildings, we turned shallow, wide townhouses so that you can put in a multifamily building on their side, and or narrow townhouses that get more depth in a multifamily building, and made them shallow wide to line a building. So we have a 14-foot type that was that we got built, that we got someone to actually go out and say, yeah, we want to do that. And that's exciting too. And there are other of those kinds of successes that the book celebrates.
That's great. So I'm going to introduce some questions from the audience now. So Rosalind asks, I think this was from the beginning of the talk, when you say strong neighborhoods, what do you mean by that? Strong real estate values, strong connections among neighbors, or something else?
I there's a professor I had named Hanno Weber. He was a Princeton for many years. He did the Leesburg City Hall, which is in this book because it's honestly one of the most amazing, probably one of the best postmodern, or he might hate it called postmodern, but buildings. But he has a saying that success in what we do is about juggling a lot of balls and having a whole bunch of balls in the air. And so a successful neighborhood, has a lot of different balls in the air, and you can't really point to one characteristic that makes them successful. Short north of Columbus has walkability, has a lot of restaurants, is really affordable. It has a lot of student housing in it that makes it successful. It has a very expensive housing in it too, and they're on top of each other, and they're part of what makes its charm and character. It's just north. You have to cross a highway to get to a market hall that's been there forever. And in order to connect to that, they actually convinced the city to pay to line two sides of a bridge with buildings. So the pedestrian connection goes over an interstate highway, and you don't know it if you walk down that roadway to the market hall. And so those are measures of success, things that they achieved that no one else could have. And then they're starting to be thought of elsewhere. It happened in Tokyo and Columbus, Ohio. Well, that's impressive, and that's one of their successes. But there are, the policy, the J51 policy that New York City put in place in the 70s, when the warehouses in Soho were rough and only artists and strange people would want to live there, created a place now where the housing is so exclusive that it's almost exclusionary. And so that's a different set of success. There's a certain kinds of success financially, but not in other ways. And we can talk about that and what that means, and how do we create communities that are inclusionary and that are that go beyond gentrification and add. We have a term in our firm called adification, which isn't displacement. You allow people to stay, but you add people that then add resources and add amenities, and you're all of a sudden part of a real community, a stronger community. And so when I talk about strength, it's all those balls getting juggled and coming together. Housing options, housing opportunity, retail options, mobility, flexibility. It'd be great to have a neighborhood where parking spaces were everywhere and there was amazing transit, but that's, as you get to a more dense place, the freedom offered by the automobile in the suburbs, it becomes a burden. And so the question is, that's an interesting aspect of American planning right now. It's like, how do we deal with that, and how do we talk about
So that's actually a great transition to the next question, which is really about the automobile. This is from Bruce. He says, it seems like this kind of development is difficult because of the application of sprawl paradigms to urban building types. Parking and sprawling grocery stores are expensive and difficult in urban places. So how do you respond to that? Because I mean, of course, that's true, but that happens on a policy level, not so much on a design level.
that? So there's innovation that happens, and there's one of the types that didn't really exist, well, it became re-evolved, I'll say, because there were some examples, but was this notion of the large format retailer on the second floor in an urban setting. So you would have a building that has small shops on the ground floor, parking behind, and a large format retailer above. And there was one being proposed in Columbia Heights with a Target upstairs and smaller shops on the ground floor, and then a lot of parking below. And it was so unheard of that the bankers insisted on an excessive amount of parking. And we did an estimate, and they basically spent $27 million on parking spaces that no one is using in that building, because it was such a type that hadn't existed before. But they're willing to, Target was on board when they opened it. It was the number 1 or 2 Target in the nation because the need and demand was there. But they didn't need all the parking. And so that type has evolved. And we were, right after that opened, we were working on one with Safeway in Georgetown. The Social Safeway originally was a store at the front of the site of a smaller 10,000 square foot store. As the competitive supermarket got challenged in the 70s, they built a then competitive 25 to 30,000 square foot store at the back of the lot with a nice convenient lot at front that really didn't contribute to Georgetown. And so we came back and they wanted a 65, 70,000 square foot store. And so what we then put together was a store on the second floor with liner shops on the front, parking below, and a lot in back. So those who was on a ramp that read like a roadway, like a street. And so when those who wanted that conventional experience could just drive up the street, park in the back lot, and go in the store like they used to. But on inclement days, you could also park underneath the store, take an elevator up, and stay dry. And so, those types have evolved, and now there's examples of those of large format users on second floor all over the country now. Philadelphia's got one in Northern Liberties. There's a bunch in Chicago, and obviously there's the DC USA spawned the Harlem USA, and so there's those stores. There's a bunch in Miami as well. So there's an evolution, but it is the challenge of thinking of these types that came from the suburbs. There's one in which is a wholly new type in Vancouver, which has a supermarket with a Home Depot, a residential neighborhood on top of that, and then liner retail where they could fill it in around the parking below all that. And it's an amazing project, and it's called The Rise, and because there was so much greater on that site, the Home Depot opens to one corner on the main street on Canby, and the supermarket opens up on the other corner, a story down. Again, a very innovative solution to bring the types that evolved through this from suburban markets into more walkable places, more urban communities.
Great. Okay, Jeremiah asks, is there any interesting innovative attempts to reinforce or enhance the amount of green space in urban corridors, parks, increasing in walkable space? Can you speak to the push and pull between creating more walkable space, open areas, and also maximizing density and use in valuable urban areas?
Yes, and I am almost want to kind of, how should I pull it up? I have a whole presentation on a project we worked on in Meriden, Connecticut. I grew up right around there. Meriden's a very interesting place. It used to be the heart of the silver industry for the United States. There was a set of parcels in the center of Meriden. And there's a beautiful image I can find if anyone's interested, or if you want to talk to me after the presentation, I'll pull it out. An aerial from a photograph from the late 50s of all these old silver factories and silver foundries that were on this parcel. And they decided, the silver industry had moved, got a lot more competitive, got consolidated. There's only one major silver foundry now in Meriden, and all the rest of the industry is overseas. And so all these foundries went away, and they replaced it. They cleared it and put a shopping mall in. That shopping mall failed. Oh, they covered a stream that was running through the middle of all this. They put it in a conduit. That shopping mall failed after 10 years, and then they replaced that with a strip mall with a supermarket that survived for 15, 20 years maybe, and then that failed, and they made government offices out of that, and every couple of years that flooded. And so in the end, they decided to replace that completely with a town green. And Meriden was an interesting city because lots of Connecticut jurisdictions have greens of different sizes and scales and shapes. And this is something I researched with Tiana Balmori at Yale, in the 90s or in the 80s and 90s when I graduated. And Meriden chose to build a new one because their community had downsized. And so they took this mall out and they replaced the entirety of it with a green. And it was an abandoned box with surrounding parking lots, and they just ripped it out, ground all the concrete, and created this town green that's there now, that you could see. And there's been other investment, mostly affordable tax credit housing, but we worked on one with the Michaels Corporation. Penrose, who's another client of ours, did one on the north side of the green with a mixed-use building with restaurants in it. That has proven to be successful, and is beginning to turn. And again, they put a new station on the green. I think they demolished some beautiful buildings to do that on Colony Street. That was unfortunate, but they've come back to a way of trying to reestablish an anchor and a core for Meriden again, and reinvigorate what used to be a really vibrant city. And that's an interesting, and it's a gutsy thing to do and an impressive move. But so if you're looking for a place that they've reintroduced green space, Meriden is one of a great case, an example, and it's in Ellen Dunham Jones and June Williamson's new book that just came out, and you can read all about it there.
Wonderful. Let's see. So a question from an anonymous person says, you mentioned the interesting example of the drywall industry's input in developing parameters for a particular building type. Were there other interesting cases you encountered where specific industry actors had similar impact on the development of forms at the building or community level?
All the time, happening constantly.
That's a big story.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, where do you see it? You'll see it in the window industry, the glazing industry. I mean, honestly, modernism is built on technical innovation. It comes from code impositions and then reactions to the new codes. So passive, communities enact requirements for passive house. The tax credit agency in Connecticut had a passive house recommendation, if you will. And because of that, the Meriden project we worked on was passive house. And we started using compression seal windows, which happens all the time in Scandinavia, but is rare in the United States. And so that moves the industry. Other ways things move are just innovative solutions. I'm excited about a lot of the parking, what's happening with parking technology. There are a number of parking storage systems, of automated parking storage systems that are getting very sophisticated. And a lot of them are tray-based, and some of them have trays that can move around on a computer network, and then sort of like a shuffle game of efficiently managed space and volume. But there are others that each of those trays happen to be like $7,000 or $8,000 that try to find a way of not having the tray at all and use pinchers to pick up your car and move it to a slot in a rack. And because of that, that solution may end up being $10,000 cheaper. So that, all of a sudden, the cost of a space in a precast garage creeps up to 18 to 20,000 a space, and these guys can come in with a way of saving in volume and storing a car that's $9,000 or $8,000. We may be seeing a lot more of those getting built. And I don't think the car is going away. I think automation, autonomous vehicles will still create a market for us to have privatized mobility. So the question is, how do we manage that in the future? No one has the answers, but it's going to change our infrastructure in big ways. The government of Singapore originally had a gantry system like Stockholm and London. You come into the downtown, you get charged a tax. But they realized that would not be effective in the long term, because once you're in, the challenges, particularly the autonomous vehicles, is that there are nexus that people really want to get to. And you have an autonomous motorhome, you can fill it up with fuel and drive 5th Avenue, 56th Street, 6th Avenue, 57th Street, 24/7, and it's cheaper than rent in any of the buildings around there. And that's a problem. And there'll be huge throughput challenges. And so what Singapore came up with was a GPS tolling, which I expect will eventually be the solution for managing autonomous vehicles, where different blocks will be priced. Every roadway segment will have a price, and the prices will be time-based. During the rush hour, it'll be a lot more expensive to drive that roadway segment than it will be in the middle of the night. And so those innovations are all happening and are impacting how we design for the built environment.
So I think we only have time for about one more question. So apologies to those who've asked questions and haven't gotten an answer yet. So this question, I think, is about maybe about style and public representation. This person asked, can you talk more about design choices, remixed typologies that are less about spatially motivated and more about the intended effect they're meant to have on target demographics or communities? For instance, the use of modern, I assume by modern they mean modern styling for a garage, or using local school colors in a facade and other kinds of signals to the public.
At least I can only talk about this from personal design methodology. We tend to be reactive and responsive when we're doing work, particularly on larger, high-profile projects, where we get the temperature of what's appropriate and what will be welcoming. In Atlanta, and then that process is we're in the midst of that process. There's a lot of community outreach and discussion, trying to hear how people react, what the impression is, what the attitude is, where folks envision their community. I've been fortunate to go to Australia and see how they implement most of these types. And the Australian worldview is incredibly forward reaching in terms of the architectural community and the market at the moment. They are not interested in pursuing traditional styles, and they are very interested in looking. They feel it's a new country and should have new architecture, and so the community preference in those places tend to be for modern works. Not always. There's some who love the Victorian terrace houses of Melbourne, for example. They're just gorgeous. And there's a place called Mawson Lakes in South Australia, outside of Adelaide, that has a mix of some traditional and a lot of modern. It's a fascinating place to go and look at architecture. You know, we're working in a place. I'm hoping to be working in a place in New Jersey, and just recently had a conversation there, and they're very adamant. They want modern. They want a forward-thinking worldview, and so there's a couple ways of getting there. We are stylistic agnostic to a point. We want well-designed buildings, but we can implement modern. In our firm, we're good at doing modern and as well as traditional styles, and so we can solve that. But there are other places where they'll go and hire a modern architect or hire a traditional architect, and that's a fine process as well. But for us, it's the art of community investment, community involvement, as I was trying to say. And so for that, it's listening and saying, well, what's going to get you going? What's going to be exciting? What can we do that says, wow, I really want to come here over and over and this is my home. This is my place. And so that's what we seek in our process. And that process may not be right for all designers, but it is for who we are at this time, or at least who I am at this time. I don't want to speak for everyone in my firm, but I do feel that as something that I think brings us together, or at least my partners and co-workers. So
Great. Well, I hope everyone will join me in thanking Brian for a very interesting talk. I don't know how we do this because everyone's quiet, but I'll clap. We'll see you at the next event. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.